In the autumn of 1968, deep within the dense tropical jungle of South Vietnam, a group of American soldiers did something so unexpected, so absurd and so utterly human, that it would become one of the most surreal moments of the entire Vietnam War. On the night of October 31st, these young men, thousands of miles from home, and surrounded by an enemy that could strike at any moment, decided to throw a Halloween costume party. They fashioned crude costumes from whatever materials they could scavenge. They played music, they laughed, and for a few precious hours, they tried to forget where they were. What made this event even more extraordinary was that their enemy, the Viet Cong fighters who had been tracking their movements through the jungle canopy, stopped their operations to watch this bizarre spectacle unfold. According to veterans who were present that night, the guerrilla fighters sat in the trees, completely bewildered by what they were witnessing, unable to comprehend why these American soldiers would engage in such strange behavior in the middle of a combat zone. To understand why this event occurred, and why it resonated so deeply with those who participated, we must first understand the psychological state of American troops in Vietnam during the fall of 1968. This was a pivotal and devastating year in the war. The Tet Offensive had erupted in January, shattering American illusions about progress in the conflict and revealing that the enemy was far more capable and resilient than military leadership had led the public to believe. By October, the American people had watched the Democratic National Convention in Chicago descend into chaos and violence. They had witnessed the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. The social fabric of the United States was tearing apart, and the soldiers fighting in the jungles of Southeast Asia were acutely aware of the turmoil back home. They read letters from family members describing protests, riots, and a growing movement that viewed them not as heroes but as participants in an immoral war. The psychological toll on these young men cannot be overstated. The average age of American combat soldiers in Vietnam was 19 years old, significantly younger than in previous conflicts. Many had been drafted against their will, pulled from colleges, farms, and city streets to fight in a war they barely understood. They found themselves in a combat environment unlike anything American forces had experienced before. There were no front lines in the traditional sense, no territory that could be definitively secured and held. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, emerging from tunnel systems, disguised as civilians, attacking at night, and melting back into the population. The jungle itself was an adversary, with its suffocating heat, torrential monsoon rains, venomous snakes, aggressive insects, and diseases like malaria and dysentery that ravaged units as effectively as enemy fire. The nature of the war created a peculiar rhythm of existence for these soldiers. They would spend days or weeks on patrol, moving through terrain so dense that visibility extended only a few meters in any direction, never knowing if the next step would trigger a booby trap, or if the tree line ahead concealed an ambush. The constant state of hypervigilance, the adrenaline that never fully subsided, the lack of sleep, and the knowledge that death could arrive without warning created a psychological pressure cooker. Then, periodically, they would return to a firebase or base camp for a brief respite before heading back into the bush. During these interludes, the military tried to maintain some semblance of normal life, providing hot meals, mail from home, and occasional entertainment. But the respite was always temporary, and the return to danger inevitable. By the fall of 1968, after months or even years of this grinding existence, many soldiers had developed coping mechanisms that ranged from dark humor to emotional detachment to a fierce loyalty to their immediate unit that superseded any broader ideological commitment to the war effort. They fought not for grand strategic objectives or political goals, but for the men beside them, for the desperate hope of surviving long enough to return home. In this context, the preservation of some connection to their former lives, to the people they had been before the war, became crucially important for maintaining sanity and a sense of identity. Halloween had always occupied a unique place in American culture. Unlike more solemn holidays that emphasized family gatherings or patriotic reflection, Halloween was about playfulness, creativity, and a temporary escape from normal rules and identities. For young Americans, it represented one of the last occasions when adults permitted, even encouraged, childlike behavior and imagination. The act of putting on a costume and pretending to be someone or something else was fundamentally about transformation and escapism. For soldiers trapped in the relentless reality of jungle warfare, the appeal of such transformation would have been almost intoxicating. The decision to hold a Halloween party in 1968 did not come from military leadership. No commanding officer issued orders for this event. Instead, it emerged organically from the soldiers themselves, likely beginning as a joke or wistful comment that gained momentum as others latched onto the idea. Someone probably said something like, "Hey, it's almost Halloween. Remember Halloween back home?" And from that seed, the concept grew. In an environment where soldiers had virtually no control over their circumstances, where their lives were dictated by orders from above, and the chaotic violence of combat, the ability to create something of their own choosing, to exercise agency over even a single evening, would have been deeply appealing. The unit in question was operating in what veterans recall as a particularly hostile area of operations, somewhere in the dense jungle regions, where the Viet Cong maintained a strong presence. The exact location has been disputed over the years, with some accounts placing it in the Central Highlands, while others suggest it was further south. But what matters is that these soldiers were deep in Indian country, as they called enemy-controlled territory. They were not in a secure base camp with walls and watchtowers. They were in a temporary position in the jungle, likely a night defensive perimeter, where they had established a loose circle of fighting positions, connected by fields of fire, with listening posts pushed out into the darkness to provide early warning of enemy approach. Planning a party under such circumstances required considerable ingenuity and risk-taking. The soldiers could not simply go to a store and purchase costumes. They had to create them from the limited materials available in the jungle and from their military equipment. According to veteran accounts, the creativity displayed was remarkable given the constraints. Some soldiers fashioned ghost costumes by cutting holes in white undershirts or medical gauze. Others created monster masks from C-ration boxes, cardboard, and camouflage paint. One soldier reportedly dressed as a vampire, using a poncho as a cape, with fake fangs carved from plastic. Another became a mummy by wrapping himself in bandages from medical supplies. The most elaborate costume, which multiple veterans remember vividly, involved a soldier who constructed a surprisingly convincing Frankenstein's monster outfit using green camouflage paint, combat boots to increase his height, and careful application of makeup to create the famous neck bolts and scars. The effort required to create these costumes was significant, and soldiers would have worked on them during breaks in patrol operations or during security rotations when they were not on watch. They would have been careful to keep their preparations somewhat quiet, aware that some officers might disapprove of frivolity in a combat zone. The fact that they proceeded anyway speaks to a kind of defiance, a refusal to allow the war to completely strip away their humanity and their connection to normal life. They were asserting, through this act of absurdity, that they were still the young men they had been before Vietnam, still capable of joy and foolishness, still connected to the world beyond the jungle. As October 31st approached, word of the planned party spread through the unit. The mood among the soldiers shifted noticeably. Men who had been withdrawn and taciturn began to show glimmers of enthusiasm. The anticipation of something different, something fun, provided a psychological boost that manifested in improved morale. Veterans recall that even soldiers who initially dismissed the idea as stupid or dangerous eventually found themselves drawn into the preparations. There was an infectious quality to the excitement, a collective embrace of the absurd that united the unit in a way that routine operations never could. On the night of Halloween, as darkness fell over the jungle, the soldiers began their transformation. In the flickering light of carefully shielded candles and the dim glow of red-filtered flashlights, they put on their homemade costumes. The process of dressing up was itself a form of ritual, a deliberate stepping away from their identities as soldiers and warriors. For those hours, they were not infantrymen in a combat zone. They were kids playing dress-up, reclaiming a piece of childhood innocence that the war had stolen from them. The laughter began even before the costumes were complete, as soldiers caught glimpses of their friends in various states of transformation, and the sheer ridiculousness of what they were doing became apparent. Someone had managed to obtain or rig up a portable radio or cassette player, and music began to fill the night air. The choice of music would have been crucial. These young men would have gravitated toward the rock and soul that defined their generation. Creedence Clearwater Revival, the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, Aretha Franklin. The songs that poured out of that speaker in the Vietnamese jungle were anthems of a turbulent America, music that spoke to rebellion, questioning authority, and the search for meaning in chaotic times. The volume was probably kept relatively low, conscious of operational security, but loud enough to be heard throughout their defensive perimeter. The effect would have been surreal, the distinctly American sounds of rock and roll echoing through an ancient Asian jungle, a collision of cultures and contexts that epitomized the disorientation of the entire Vietnam experience. The party itself was modest by any conventional standard. There was no alcohol readily available, though some soldiers may have had stashes of contraband liquor. There was no elaborate food beyond their standard rations, though some might have saved special items from care packages for the occasion. What they had was each other, their costumes, their music, and their determination to create a moment of normalcy in the midst of madness. They told jokes, they danced awkwardly, they took photographs with cameras that some soldiers carried, preserving images that would decades later seem like artifacts from an alternate reality. They engaged in the kind of horseplay and teasing that characterizes young men everywhere, momentarily forgetting the weapons that lay close at hand and the danger that surrounded them. What makes this story truly extraordinary is what was happening in the trees above and in the jungle around them. The Viet Cong fighters who had been shadowing this American unit, who had been preparing for a potential ambush or gathering intelligence on their movements, found themselves confronted with something completely outside their frame of reference. These guerrilla soldiers, many of them peasant farmers, when not fighting, had never seen Halloween before. They had no cultural context for understanding why enemy soldiers would paint their faces, wear strange costumes, and dance around playing loud music when they should have been maintaining security and preparing for the dangers of the jungle night. According to American veterans who spoke to Vietnamese former soldiers in the decades after the war, the Viet Cong fighters were genuinely confused and uncertain about how to respond. They watched from concealed positions in the trees and undergrowth, trying to comprehend whether this was some kind of psychological operation, a trap, or simply incomprehensible foreign behavior. Some thought the Americans might be drunk or using drugs. Others wondered if it was some kind of religious ceremony. A few apparently considered it a sign that the American soldiers had gone mad from the stress of combat. The very strangeness of the scene created a kind of protective bubble around the American position, because the Viet Cong commanders were unwilling to initiate an attack without understanding what they were seeing. There is something profoundly human in this moment of mutual incomprehension. Both groups of young men, locked in a vicious war that would claim tens of thousands of lives, paused because something unexpected had disrupted the familiar patterns of conflict. The Viet Cong soldiers, despite their training and their commitment to driving the Americans from their country, were curious. They were witnessing something so alien to their experience that their natural human inquisitiveness overcame their tactical objectives. And in that curiosity, in that moment of watching rather than fighting, there was an implicit recognition of the humanity of their enemies. These were not faceless imperialist invaders in that moment. They were young men doing something bizarre and inexplicable, but undeniably human. The American soldiers, absorbed in their party, were largely unaware of the audience they had attracted. A few sentries on the perimeter maintained watch, but even they were distracted by the festivities behind them. The standard security protocols were relaxed, not abandoned but definitely loosened. In hindsight, veterans acknowledged this was dangerous and violated basic tactical principles. They were making themselves vulnerable, creating noise and light that could attract enemy attention, dropping their guard in an area where constant vigilance was essential for survival. Yet nothing happened. The night passed without incident, without incoming fire or probing attacks, or the sudden chaos of an ambush. The party continued until soldiers gradually drifted back to their fighting positions, removed their costumes and settled into the normal rotation of guard duty and sleep. It was only later, through various channels of communication and investigation, that the American unit learned about their watchers in the trees. Some information came through intelligence channels through interrogations of Viet Cong prisoners, or defectors who mentioned the strange incident. Other details emerged from post-war conversations between American veterans and their former Vietnamese adversaries, meetings that became more common as decades passed, and the veterans on both sides aged and sought understanding of their shared experience. The Vietnamese soldiers remembered the Halloween party vividly, often with a sense of bemused wonder at the strangeness of American culture. They described their confusion, their debates among themselves about what was happening, and their decision to simply watch rather than attack, because the situation was so unexpected. The psychological significance of this event extends far beyond the single night on which it occurred. For the American soldiers who participated, the Halloween party became a cherished memory, a bright spot in the darkness of their Vietnam experience. In subsequent years, as they struggled with post-traumatic stress, with nightmares and survivor's guilt and the challenge of reintegrating into a society that often treated them with indifference or hostility, they could look back on that night as proof that they had maintained their humanity. They had not allowed the war to completely transform them into killing machines. They had preserved the ability to be silly, to laugh, to connect with their fellow soldiers through joy rather than just shared danger. The memory became a form of psychological armor, a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, human beings can create moments of light. The story also reveals something profound about the absurdity and arbitrariness of war. Here were two groups of young men, designated as enemies by forces beyond their control, locked in a conflict that most of them barely understood. They were willing to kill each other, to ambush and be ambushed, to inflict terrible violence in service of broader strategic and political objectives that had little to do with their individual lives. Yet when confronted with something unexpected, something that broke the pattern of normal military operations, they reverted to a more fundamental human response. The Americans sought joy and escape. The Vietnamese watched with curiosity rather than immediately attacking. For one night, the machine of war stuttered and paused, not because of any grand gesture or peace initiative, but because young men in costumes confused everyone involved. This incident illuminates the cultural gulf that existed between American forces and the Vietnamese, both enemy and ally. American culture, with its emphasis on individualism, entertainment, and the temporary suspension of normal rules during holidays, was profoundly foreign to Vietnamese society. The Viet Cong fighters, operating within a very different cultural framework, where collective identity and discipline and ideological commitment were paramount, simply had no reference point for understanding Halloween. This cultural incomprehension worked both ways throughout the war. American soldiers often failed to understand Vietnamese customs, values, and ways of thinking, just as the Vietnamese struggled to make sense of American behavior. The Halloween party was an extreme example of this mutual incomprehension, but it reflected a broader pattern that complicated every aspect of the war. The military leadership's response to learning about the party was probably mixed. On one hand, any activity that improved morale was valuable in a war where psychological degradation was a constant concern. On the other hand, The security violations were significant, and the risk taken was substantial. If the Viet Cong had decided to attack during the party, the unit could have suffered serious casualties. The fact that nothing bad happened did not negate the foolishness of the risk from a tactical perspective. However, there is no record of anyone being court-martialed or seriously punished for the incident, which suggests that commanders recognized the complex realities their soldiers were facing and perhaps granted some leeway for the sake of morale. The broader context of American morale in Vietnam during 1968 helps explain why soldiers would take such a risk. By this point in the war, many combat troops had become cynical about the mission and the leadership. They questioned whether the objectives were achievable, whether the South Vietnamese government they were defending was worth defending, and whether their sacrifices meant anything. The official optimism from Saigon and Washington rang hollow after Tet. Soldiers increasingly operated with a short-timer mentality, focused primarily on surviving their tour and getting home. In this environment, traditional military discipline and unit cohesion were strained. Instances of soldiers refusing orders, fragging of unpopular officers, and widespread drug use reflected the deterioration of morale. The Halloween party can be seen as a relatively benign manifestation of this breakdown in traditional military culture, a way for soldiers to assert their individuality and their connection to home in defiance of the institutional military that seemed indifferent to their well-being. The role of memory and storytelling in preserving this incident is also significant. For decades after the war, the Halloween party existed primarily in the memories of those who participated and in stories shared among veterans. It was not the kind of event that made official military histories or newspaper headlines. It did not involve heroism or tragedy in the conventional sense. Yet for those who were there, it was worth remembering and retelling. As Vietnam veterans aged and began to process their experiences more publicly, stories like this one began to emerge. Veteran organizations, reunions, and eventually the internet provided forums for sharing memories that had been private for years. The Halloween party story spread, taking on slightly different details and different tellings, but maintaining its essential character as a moment of surreal humanity in the midst of war. The fact that Vietnamese veterans also remembered and discussed the incident validates its significance. In post-war Vietnam, former Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army soldiers had their own process of memory and storytelling, their own efforts to make sense of their experiences. When Americans and Vietnamese began meeting in programs designed to promote reconciliation and mutual understanding, the Halloween party sometimes came up in conversation. The Vietnamese veterans who had watched from the trees could tell their side of the story, describing their confusion and their decision not to attack. These conversations, happening decades after the fact, provided a kind of closure and mutual recognition that the war itself never allowed. The incident raises interesting questions about the ethics and psychology of combat. Is it appropriate for soldiers in a combat zone to prioritize entertainment and morale over security? Does the maintenance of psychological health and human connection justify taking tactical risks? There are no simple answers to these questions. Military doctrine emphasizes vigilance, discipline, and the subordination of individual desires to unit objectives. Yet the soldiers who threw the Halloween party were not unprofessional or cowardly. Many of them were combat veterans, with months or years of experience in the jungle. They understood the risks they were taking, and they made a conscious choice that their psychological and emotional needs in that moment outweighed the tactical considerations. From a purely military perspective, they were wrong. From a human perspective, their choice was entirely understandable, and perhaps even necessary. The story also highlights the role of chance and contingency in war. The fact that the Viet Cong decided not to attack that night was not the result of any strategic calculation by the Americans. It was a matter of luck, of the enemy's confusion and caution in the face of the unexpected. Had different Viet Cong commanders been in position, or had the situation been interpreted differently, the Halloween party could have ended in disaster. This element of chance, where survival or death can hinge on factors completely outside one's control, was a constant reality in Vietnam. Soldiers learned to live with radical uncertainty, never knowing if they would survive their next patrol, or even their next hour. In this context, seizing opportunities for joy when they arose, even if those opportunities came with risks, made a kind of desperate sense. The physical environment of the jungle shaped every aspect of this event. The dense vegetation that provided cover for the Viet Cong observers also limited visibility, making it harder for the Americans to detect threats. The constant background noise of insects, animals, and rustling leaves masked sounds that might otherwise alert sentries to danger. The oppressive heat and humidity, even at night, sapped energy and made sustained vigilance difficult. The jungle was a participant in this drama, creating the conditions that made the party both possible and dangerous. For American soldiers, the jungle was often described as a living thing, hostile and alien, a green maze that disoriented and trapped them. Yet on this night, they tried to claim a small piece of that jungle as their own, to transform it temporarily into a space of celebration rather than danger. The costumes themselves, crude as they were, represented a significant psychological investment. Creating them required time, thought, and a willingness to be vulnerable through playfulness. In the military culture of masculinity and toughness that pervaded combat units, dressing up in costumes could be seen as effeminate or childish. Yet the soldiers who participated overcame these cultural barriers because the pull of home and normalcy was stronger. They were willing to look foolish to each other because they all understood the deeper need they were addressing. The costumes became a uniform of a different kind, marking them temporarily as something other than soldiers, as participants in a ritual that connected them to their lives before and hopefully after the war. In the final analysis, the Halloween party in the jungle on October 31, 1968, stands as one of the most poignant and revealing incidents of the entire Vietnam War. It showed young men trying desperately to maintain their humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. It revealed the cultural chasms that separated Americans and Vietnamese, even as they were locked in intimate violence. It demonstrated the power of the unexpected to disrupt even the most entrenched patterns of conflict, and it provided both American and Vietnamese veterans with a shared memory that, in its very strangeness, offered a kind of mutual recognition that formal peace processes never achieved. Those men in the jungle, both the ones in costume and the ones watching from the trees, participated in something that transcended the war, a moment of pure human absurdity that somehow makes the horror of everything else more bearable and more understandable. They were all so young, all so far from home or fighting to defend their home, all caught in forces beyond their control, and for one night they all paused to wonder at the strangeness of human behavior in the midst of war.